my favourite quote of hers was, "I will have but one mistress here and no master." She's fought for that throne. She doesn't want to share her power.
What leadership lessons can we learn from history's most powerful people? I'm entrepreneur Mike Soutar, author of Next Gen CEO. You may also know me as a ruthless interviewer for Lord Sugar on BBC One's The Apprentice. In History Extra's new series, History's Greatest Leaders, I'm joined by experts to unpick the lives and decisions of the past's most formidable figures. What can they still teach us today? If you are as fascinated as I am by leadership, ambition, and the people who changed history, you're in the right place. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Today, I'm joined by Tracy Borman, Chief Historian at Historic Royal Palaces and the best-selling author of numerous books, including the brilliant Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I, the revelatory true story of the mother and daughter who changed history. Tracy, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's such a pleasure, Mike, and I'm excited to get into this.
Well, listen, we are going to be talking about the Tudor Queen, Elizabeth I, a monarch so iconic that she still features in our popular imagination today, almost 500 years after her birth. In your view, what made her so unique?
I think for Elizabeth, she was the ultimate underdog because she was the forgotten younger daughter of Henry VIII, yet she went on to become by far the longest reigning, most successful of all his heirs. And she shouldn't have been queen at all. And I think she fought against so much prejudice. This wasn't an age where women were supposed to be in charge, and she did it all brilliantly.
She was an extraordinary leader, and that's really what we want to focus on today, her leadership skills, her approaches, her techniques, and so on. But I want to get to an apparent contradiction about her in the way that her leadership style is now viewed. On one hand, a massively strong and dynamic leader, the Virgin Queen, married to her people, who leads her country to military victory over the all-powerful superpower that is Spain. But on the other hand, she's perceived as being indecisive. She delays controversial decisions. She vacillates over key issues such as religion, marriage, and the succession. Tracy, why do these opposing views exist?
They're both true. And I know that's a slightly annoying sitting on the fence historian answer, but they absolutely are. I think what it comes down to is that when you hear the word leader, you think decisive, lead from the front, make quick decisions, tell people this is how it's going to be. But as you will know, Mike, that's not necessarily every definition of a leader. And sometimes in not making a decision, that was a decision in itself for Elizabeth. And she really brilliantly played on the prejudice against her as a woman. So she knew that her male counsellors all thought, well, this woman, she's never going to be able to run a country. Women can't make decisions. So when she was under pressure to, for example, settle the succession or to marry, she would say, well, what do you expect? I just can't decide. I need more time, guys.
So she actually used that as a strategy?
Yeah, that was a deliberate strategy to buy more time. And often what happened, and this was deliberate, is things settled in a certain way. It was too soon to make a decision on a policy issue or, an overseas alliance, whatever it might be. She needed more time to see how things were going to play out. So it wasn't just indecision and sort of being paralysed by that. It was a deliberate ploy. But when she needed to, she could be every bit as mercurial as her father, Henry VIII, and absolutely tell people how it was going to be.
Well, talking about her father then, give us a sense of the Tudor world, Tudor England, the world that Elizabeth I is born into.
A very, very turbulent world. Nobody can surely have had a worse childhood in the Tudor age than Elizabeth herself. You just have to look at her mother's history. She's the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the scandal of Christendom, Henry VIII's second wife, who he overturned everything in order to marry, breaking England from Rome, the original Brexit, if you like. And this marriage was forged, but it soon dissolved when Anne didn't give him a son, only a daughter, Elizabeth. Then Elizabeth finds herself out in the cold after her father orders her mother's execution. And she ends up in the Tower during her sister Mary's reign on suspicion of plotting against her. It's an incredibly turbulent and dangerous time for Elizabeth. But what it does is to kind of chisel her into this fearsome leader. And really, it's the making of her. I think a child like that, it would make or break you.
I mean, it is an unconventional upbringing, shall we say? I mean, your father orders the beheading of your mother. I mean, that's got to leave some sort of psychological marks on you, right? Absolutely. Do those things show in her as a character?
They really do. And of course, you always have to be careful not to layer on too much of a 21st century perspective. This was a bloodthirsty age. Even so, can you imagine a modern day psychoanalyst? So tell me about when your father ordered your mother's execution. Of course, it left deep scars, and I think was the number one reason why Elizabeth chose not to marry. Certainly that was to do with politics as well. My favourite quote of hers was, "I will have but one mistress here and no master." She's fought for that throne. She doesn't want to share her power. But at the same time, there are examples of how she becomes almost hysterical when pressured to marry. She's deeply, deeply terrified at the idea of marriage and childbirth. It had been the death of her mother.
That's so interesting. And I think we can get into some of that soon. If we look at her as a child, she was, by all accounts, extraordinarily bright and accomplished.
Yes. Very, very precocious. Here's a young woman. She was less than 3 when her mother was executed, but she immediately realised that people were addressing her in a different way. And so she famously said to one of her household, "Why is everyone calling me Lady Elizabeth when I was Princess Elizabeth yesterday?" 2 years, 8 months old. She could speak several languages by the age of 8. She was just this brilliant, intellectual young woman and loved to learn.
Which is rare, right? For a woman of 500 years ago to have enjoyed such an incredible education. I mean, that must have been so rare.
It was rare. It was becoming less rare in aristocratic circles, but even so, Elizabeth was a child prodigy, just like her mother Anne Boleyn had been, actually. And it's interesting, as queen, when things were getting too much and she needed time out, did she go and soak in the baths? She did not. She went to translate Greek texts. That's what she did for fun. So she kind of carried on learning throughout her life.
As a child, she was not regarded as particularly likely ever to become the monarch. Is that right?
Rank outsider. So when her mother was executed, Elizabeth was declared a bastard. She was removed from the line of succession. Henry VIII wanted to forget all about her. She had an elder sister, and then she had a brother. So, of course, the brother would be first in line, but he died young, and then her sister only reigned for 5 years. And then Elizabeth, against all the odds, comes to the throne. I do think there's something interesting in this, because having studied the monarchy, I've seen that often the best monarchs are those who are not expected to come to the throne. And I don't know what that says, if they don't come with that same sense of entitlement, if they work harder for it. But it was definitely the case with Elizabeth.
Oh, that's really interesting, isn't it? So to come to that sort of power when you don't take it for granted will often mean that you ultimately end up doing a better job. I mean, I suppose Elizabeth II was a great example of that, right? Somebody who was never likely to be queen. That's a really interesting theory.
Yeah, I think it goes in your favour if you are an underdog. And it certainly did with Elizabeth. And what she'd done very cleverly was to learn from her predecessors. And she'd learned what worked and what didn't in terms of leadership. And the best example for her was her sister Mary, because she was the first queen regnant in over 300 years. And Elizabeth saw the mistakes that her sister made, and she was determined to go along a very different path herself.
So just tell me very quickly about the context of kind of Tudor life and what the really big issues were as Elizabeth comes to the throne. What are the big forces?
Religion, I would say first and foremost. It dominated every aspect of life in Tudor England. It also dominated international relations. England had begun as part of Roman Catholic Europe. Elizabeth's father, Henry VIII, had changed that, breaking from Rome, setting up his own church, the Church of England, moving England towards being a Protestant state. Now, Elizabeth was very much raised a Protestant. But one of her great qualities, I think, as a leader was that she was a pragmatist. So she'd learned from her sister Mary, who was absolutely Catholic and wanted to return England to Rome. And that didn't work. She ended up sort of burning hundreds of her subjects into submission, and still it didn't work. All it did was to arouse resentment. So Elizabeth, now she never said this, but it summed up her policy. She's often quoted as saying, "I do not wish to make windows into men's souls." In other words, believe what you like in your heart, but if you publicly conform, that's okay with me.
And is that because that was Elizabeth's own point of view? Was that how she acted?
I think so. And I think she was a Protestant. She, like her mother, very much influenced by Anne Boleyn. She grew up to believe in religious reform. But she quite liked some of the old Catholic traditions. So she kept a few of them. She liked the highly decorated churches. Her own chapel was very richly adorned. So it was like a pick and mix for Elizabeth. A little bit of Catholic, mostly Protestant. But she didn't think it ought to be an issue that completely tore a country apart. So she sought something of a middle ground. Even though she was Protestant and that was the official religion, she was a lot more tolerant towards the Catholic half.
So what did Elizabeth I do that monarchs before her hadn't done? What did she actually achieve?
I think Elizabeth, she did not stand on principle. And I think it's a real luxury that you can't afford as a leader to absolutely stick rigidly to your own personal principles. You have to see which way the wind is blowing. And Elizabeth, from the beginning, showed that she was in touch with the popular mood. And I think that was part of her brilliance. She listened to her people, and she knew that they were tired of all this infighting and the divisions, and that one side was wanting to win over the other, but it was never going to happen. So she went with that and thought, okay, this religious settlement that she and her government drew up, it was a compromise. It was neither completely one thing or the other. And it did achieve something that was desperately needed in England, which was stability and peace. England had been through 20 years of turbulence and revolution. There had been rebellion against Henry VIII, her father. And then, of course, the sort of the counter-reformation under her sister Mary. And it was in a mess. So she thought, let's just find common ground between these two religious extremes. And she didn't put herself front and centre in that. She sat back and she listened to what people wanted.
That's really interesting. So was that compromise that she managed to broker, was that then the foundation for what we now regard as an extraordinary Elizabethan age of trade and commerce and empire building?
It was certainly one of the key foundation stones. There were perhaps others, but it was absolutely essential that she got this right. And it was no coincidence. This was the first thing she tried to resolve, religion, because you can't really get much further on. There is an argument, I will say, that she achieved a compromise during her reign because she was a strong leader who was widely respected. When there was a weaker leader to follow her, things started to disintegrate. It's even been said that Elizabeth's compromise in religion ultimately led to civil war in the next century because things had just been silenced. They hadn't been resolved.
Okay, that's really interesting. So her use of ambiguity in the short term, tremendously successful strategy.
Yeah.
In the long term, maybe you've got shareholders looking at the balance sheet saying, well, hang on a minute, you didn't really sort this one out.
Exactly.
And what is the advice around Elizabeth at that time? Is there advice that she ignores when it comes to that real pivot point of creating that compromise between Protestantism and Catholicism?
So Elizabeth benefits from one amazing advisor in particular, William Cecil Lord Burleigh. He is her right-hand man. And what distinguishes her most trusted advisors are they're the ones who have stood by her well before it's certain she's going to be queen. And that's how she decides, I'm going to trust you. You're not just, sucking up to me because I'm on the throne now. You've always been behind me. And that's the case with Lord Burleigh. He is very cautious, very wise, long career in politics. So she trusts him. As the reign goes on, what you see is Elizabeth adopting a style of leadership that we might call divide and rule. So her government becomes increasingly faction-riven. And she encourages that. It's almost like she doesn't want one particular party or advisor to enjoy too much power. So she plays them off deliberately against each other so that her own authority is unchecked.
I'm so interested in that, because in order to hold on to real long-term, kind of lifetime leadership, having people fight beneath you, it comes straight out of a traditional playbook, doesn't it?
Completely. And it's quite obvious. And people at the time were saying, this is her style. She divides and rules. She encourages the infighting. And her court becomes a real snake pit. Everyone's out for each other. And Elizabeth is there apparently just, floating swan-like on the surface while there is all this going on underneath.
And she has created this extraordinary iconography around herself. Is that something that we now just look back on historically because those are the only kind of paintings and images that we have? Or was that a much more deliberate policy?
So deliberate. And I would say, you talked about religion being the foundation. I would say image making was another foundation. It was pivotal to Elizabeth's success. She appreciated the power of what we might call PR more than any monarch before or since. Just 5 years into her reign, she made it law that she would control her image. Nobody was allowed to produce an image. You couldn't just paint the Queen. It had to go through her for approval. So there was a sort of official portrait. I mean, hats off to her. She never ages. So now it would be a filter to, then.
Yeah, it's an Instagram filter that always makes you look just incredible.
Absolutely. And why not? I would do the same if I had the choice. But she just got it in a way that, for example, her predecessor, Mary, she was all about her principles and religion, and she didn't really invest in her public image, and she failed miserably. So Elizabeth did it the opposite way.
It's a very modern attitude, isn't it? I mean, I think for leaders today, you have to project something. We live in an incredibly visual world, and so therefore leaders these days can't kind of hide behind the kind of corporate door with CEO written on the front. Even not wearing something that's remarkable is in and of itself a statement. So the fact that she grasped really early on that the way to communicate with her subjects and more widely and send a message out to her allies and to her enemies about the kind of person that she was, I think that's extraordinarily far-sighted.
Isn't it? And as well, what she appreciated, and I think this is a real quality of a good leader, is the need to be visible. So as you say, she didn't hide behind her office door. She was the one who really masterminded these great progresses, as they were called, where she would go on journeys around her kingdom, as long as if it wasn't further north than Watford. I have to say, she didn't go terribly far. But
Dundee is nice.
Well, a little bit chilly at sometimes a year. But she knew that she could not only had to do these great set pieces at court with the lavish entertainments and the masks, she had to take the court on the road and show herself to her people. And so Elizabethan progresses became the stuff of legend. And thousands of people would flock to see their queen. And she was an icon to them.
Where was the inspiration for that then?
So there had been progresses before, and certainly her father, Henry VIII, did them in some style. But Elizabeth took them to another level entirely. She's very canny because it's a win-win. You're showing yourself off to your people. You are exciting the commentary of your peers in Europe because they're all seeing you out on the road. And you're also saving some cash because you can just stay at other people's houses and they have to feed your entire court and entertain you. And she was like her grandfather, Henry VII. She liked to watch the pennies.
Very good. So one of the pivotal points that really showed her leadership style was this great religious compromise. The other one that I'd really like you to talk about is to do with the Armada. And in 1588, the Spanish Armada are at the shores of England. Just set this up. What are the catalysts for the conflict?
You can really say the original catalyst goes right the way back to the very beginning of Elizabeth's reign, when her former brother-in-law, Philip of Spain, he'd been married to Mary, proposes marriage to Elizabeth because he rather liked being King of England, as you would. And he was quite reluctant to let that go once Mary died. So he proposed to Elizabeth. She said a very definite no. My sister's barely cold. And also he's Catholic, she's Protestant. Yeah. So that sort of sets them on a collision course, and relations between England and Spain just get worse and worse, particularly over money. Most things boil down to money. And Spain at that time is dominating European trade. It's starting to expand into the New World. And Elizabeth's tactics and those of her privateers is basically to raid Spanish treasure ships. Okay. And so it's piracy.
She's licensing piracy at this
She
point.
is. She's turning a blind eye, encouraging delightedly when, they all come back with ships laden with gold.
This sounds very Elizabeth, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
This idea of unofficially sanctioning something and then keeping a different face on it officially.
She was brilliant at, she was sort of like Teflon woman. Nothing sticks with her. And whether it's the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, which she also said, nothing to do with me. Mm-hmm. And, the privateering of her adventurers also, no, she didn't officially instruct them to do that.
So 1588, she rides to Tilbury. Is that right?
She does, at the mouth of the Thames, to sort of rally her troops because, as it's presented to us by history, this is crisis point now. The Spanish Armada is bearing down on England's shores. Elizabeth knows that most of her government, actually probably most of her subjects, think a woman can't lead us in war. So she goes to town. She rides amongst her troops. She's apparently wearing armour, or part glorious dress that she's known for. And she makes the most famous speech of her career. And the line that's so often repeated, and I love it still, is, I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too. Cheers and all that. So that's the propaganda, and that's what we all know. In fact, the Armada had already been defeated by the time she did that. There had been a decisive battle before then. Yeah. So the Armada was sort of on its way out. So you might say Elizabeth probably knew that. And
do you think she did?
I think it's very likely that she knew the danger.
What a brilliant win-win.
Amazing.
You get to look great in front of people.
Yes. Look, I'm here, and what she does, and I know this is another trait of leadership, in that I'm one of you. She says, if need be, I will come amongst you and fight alongside you, even though actually the battle's already been won. But she makes the most of it, and I think therein lies a brilliant leader as well, because propaganda is an important pillar of leadership.
I mean, she was certainly a master of controlling the narrative.
She absolutely was. And I do think, I always hold her up as being the ultimate example of that. You neglect public relations at your peril as a leader. She is absolutely on that at all times and in all places. And for the Armada victory, as well as that speech, she has 3 separate portraits painted to celebrate the victory. She has medals struck. And what she does brilliantly is she presents it as God's victory. So God blew with his wind and they were scattered, she said. In other words, basically, the good old English weather had really won the day.
It was a Protestant wind.
It was a Protestant wind, exactly. And so it's all about divine intervention. Which side is God on? Right. On the side of Catholic Spain or Protestant England? Elizabeth makes sure, everybody knows God's on my side.
I mean, it is amazing, isn't it, to have somebody who has these instincts. The instinct, as you said earlier on, she had a kind of a populist instinct within her as well, which may well have been a part of her upbringing and her assumption that she was never going to be monarch. Yeah. having spent that long, maybe you do get more in touch with ordinary people than you might if you thought that your destiny is to become king or queen.
I think that's absolutely right, because she was forgotten. She was really cast out by her father. And I think what that turbulent upbringing gave Elizabeth was an ability never to take anything for granted and to never, ever lose touch with popular opinion.
So it'd be really interesting to think about, as we kind of close things off, the leadership advice that we might take from Elizabeth I, some of the inspiration that we might take. And we've talked about, being absolutely in touch with your audience here, your audience needs, selling them the benefits of what it is you're doing, creating a narrative that isn't just what you hear, but also what you see. What are some of the other things that you think that leaders today might either be able to learn from or in some way have kind of absorbed and are still doing these days?
I would say as well, what Elizabeth brilliantly demonstrates is don't bow to pressure. If you're being forced into making one decision or the other, often the best decision is no decision at all. And just to bide your time, see how things start to formulate before taking action. And also, there's something about playing people at their own game. Nobody thought she was going to succeed. It's a disaster. We've got another woman in charge. So play on that. She makes a virtue of her sex. She makes England fall in love with queens. She becomes the queen bee in the hive that all these adoring male courtiers have to worship. And as well, she plays on her perceived womanly weaknesses, that indecision, that changing of mind. And this just buys her time. And it enables her to assert herself in this very male-dominated world.
There's a great quote from your recent book, The Stolen Crown. She is only a woman, only the mistress of half an island, and yet she makes herself feared by Spain, by France, by empire, by all, exclaimed a dumbfounded Pope Sixtus V in the wake of the Armada. Elizabeth had apparently vanquished not just Philip II's invasion attempt, but the widely held prejudices against female sovereignty.
I think that's absolutely true. There was a sense of everyone being dumbfounded, to talk about the underdog and not just the inferior navy and country behind that, but a woman versus a male ruler. There's no way she's going to succeed. And yeah, it's summed up so brilliantly there by the Pope, who just cannot believe she's pulled it off. And yet she did, against all the odds. And it was, I was going to say turning point. As historians, we're taught not to use that phrase because it's too simplistic. But I think it was a turning point. Elizabeth's reign, it did change perceptions of female rulers, and she blazed a trail for others to follow. Queen Victoria, the second Elizabeth even. England took a very different view of queens after Elizabeth.
She had extraordinary powers as a leader. Did she always use them wisely? Did she ever abuse?
Perhaps you could say with that policy of divide and rule, in a way, that did create some instability at the heart of her government. And I think while one of the things that she constantly resisted pressure for was to name her heir. And I think it was the right move in that she would neither marry nor name her successor, because as soon as you do that, you create a rival. And she knew that. So I think she was right. But why didn't she do it on her deathbed? Why then, when arguably she's got nothing to lose, why didn't she just say, okay, yeah, it's going to be James of Scotland? But she never did. And that just created uncertainty and instability. It dealt her successor a pretty bad hand.
And so, listen, back to this central contradiction at the heart of Elizabeth I as a leader. Decisive leader or hesitant procrastinator? Was her famous indecision a strategic choice, reconciling two things, the Catholic and Protestant faiths, which seemed irreconcilable, which others had tried to bring together but couldn't, never marrying, holding on to that power that you talk about, allowing ambiguity to flourish? And it sits at odds with what we expect in the modern day a strong leader to be. Unambiguous communications, ruthlessly, quickly decisive, steamrolling opponents, my way or the highway. So let me give you the final word, Tracy. Where do you stand?
I would say that Elizabeth knew from the very beginning that being one-dimensional was not a luxury she was going to be able to enjoy. She had to be quick thinking. She had to be fleet of foot. So she couldn't just stand on principle. She did have to bend with the wind. She did have to listen to popular opinion. And I think at the heart of what seemed indecision was actually a very clear decisiveness.
Very nice. And is there anything then, just finally, that you would say that today's leaders, whether they are the CEO of a large organisation or maybe a startup founder, maybe somebody working, within the charitable sector or in government, is there any single memorable piece of advice that you would give them that when they come to some big decision, they really need to reflect on? What would Elizabeth I do?
So Elizabeth, I think, would do three things. She would listen to her advisors. She would take her time, and she would never lose sight of her audience.
And that's all we've got time for today. Tracy Borman, thank you again for being with us. Absolutely fascinating. If you want to find out more about Elizabeth I, her life and reign, then the History Extra team has put together a wealth of articles, podcasts and videos. You'll find the link to those in the description to this episode. We'll be back soon for more of history's greatest leaders. For more fascinating content on some of the past's most powerful people, visit the History Extra app now.